Everyone else thinks nothing happened, but you already know. Something just changed. And you can't explain it yet. Everything looks intact. But you already know. Something isn't. And no one else seems to notice. The table is still full. Someone is still talking. A smile arrives on cue. A joke lands. The room performs continuity so well that no one questions it. And still, somewhere inside the quieter part of attention, something resists the scene. Not overtly, not obviously, just enough to interrupt trust. You keep looking at the same face. You hear the same sentence everyone else heard. Nothing collapses, nothing exposes itself. But your mind no longer receives the moment as whole. That is where this begins. Not with proof. Not with revelation. With friction. And most people will ignore this moment because nothing has happened yet. Something appears ordinary, but it no longer settles correctly inside you. And that difference matters. Not because it is always right. Not because internal signals are sacred, but because some minds register mismatch before they can explain it, and others need more material before the shape becomes clear. That distinction matters. For INFPs, INFJs, INTJs, and INTPs, the outer event can be small. A reply that is technically fine. A pause that lasts half a second too long. A warmth that sounds rehearsed. A statement that fits the topic but not the logic, or the values, or the emotional current moving underneath it. The scene stays normal. The experience doesn't. And this is where it becomes difficult to explain, because from the outside, nothing is wrong. This is not one psychology. INTJ, INFJ, INFP, and INTP can all react to something feels off, but not for the same reason, not through the same function, and not with the same kind of certainty. Sometimes the signal is accurate. Sometimes it is only a hypothesis shaped by cognition. Sometimes the mind notices a real fracture early. Sometimes it senses one and has to wait to see whether reality will support it. That ambiguity has to stay in the story. Because the moment is powerful precisely because it is not yet settled. It often starts with a human micro-event. Someone says, "No, it's fine." And maybe it is. But the sentence arrives with a texture that doesn't belong to the words. The room keeps moving. No one stops. No one asks. No one names the shift. Still, internally, a process begins. Not everyone will call it intuition. Not everyone will even trust it. But attention changes. The mind stops participating in the moment as a simple social event. It starts cross-checking. Against pattern, against tone, against meaning, against consistency, against memory, against values. That is the cognitive fracture. Something internally changes before there is enough external closure. Not certainty as truth. Certainty as pressure. A pressure to keep watching. That is different. You've lived this before. This is the moment most people miss. Have you ever stayed in a conversation while already knowing something changed, but not being able to explain why you stayed in the conversation, but one part of you stepped back? You kept answering, but more carefully. You kept listening, but not in the same way. Because now the moment has two layers. What is happening, and what your cognition thinks might be happening beneath it. That second layer is where these four types separate. What happens next depends on how your mind processes the fracture. For the INTJ, the first disturbance is often not emotional at all. It is structural. The conversation can still look smooth on the surface, but NI has already begun doing what NI does best, compressing fragments into a pattern and comparing the current moment to the underlying trajectory it expected. The issue is not that one sentence sounded strange. The issue is that the sentence does not belong to the pattern that led up to it. A response appears where another response should have been. A decision bends away from its previous direction. A person who was internally consistent yesterday suddenly moves with a new hidden variable today. That is usually enough for NI to pause. Not because NI has the truth, because NI notices when the line no longer continues in the same shape. Then TE comes in, and this is where the tension sharpens. TE wants usable evidence. TE wants something observable, actionable, externally defensible. But the INTJ often feels the disturbance before TE has material. So now there is an internal split. NI says the pattern has been disrupted. TE says that is not yet operational. That split matters. Because the INTJ is not standing there with mystical certainty. They are standing inside a strategic irritation. I can already see the discontinuity, but I cannot justify action yet. And then FI quietly complicates it. FI in INTJ is not usually theatrical, but it does create a private line, a threshold. Something like, if this is what I think it is, then I do not want to align with it. Now the pattern problem becomes personal, not sentimental, personal. The INTJ may not say anything. But the energy changes. Their investment becomes conditional. They stop extending trust at the previous level. Then, SE, inferior and pressured, starts reacting to the unresolved present. The room gets louder. Details become invasive. The immediacy of social interaction becomes irritating because the external scene is still demanding participation while the internal model is no longer stable. That's why INTJ often looks calm in these moments. But internally, the calm is not peace. It is compression. They do not always withdraw completely. Sometimes they become more observant. Sometimes they test the pattern with one precise question. Sometimes they go silent and wait for a second signal. Sometimes they redirect the conversation toward something concrete to see whether the structure holds. INTJ does not simply feel something off. INTJ experiences pattern disruption, then TE restraint, then FI resistance, then SE pressure. That whole stack is in the room. But not everyone experiences this as a structural problem. For the INFJ, the shift often enters through the relational field first. Not because they are emotional in some vague way, because NIFE tracks meaning in human atmosphere differently. A sentence can be ordinary, but the bond around the sentence changes. A person says the right thing with the wrong emotional weight. A reassurance arrives, but it does not soothe. A smile is offered, but it lands like a social tool rather than a real continuation of connection. FE notices this immediately, not as a conclusion, but as a change in human texture. Then NI does what NI does in INFJ form. It turns that emotional shift into a trajectory. It starts asking, silently and all at once, what is this becoming? What changed between then and now? Why does the relational current suddenly feel divided? Again, this is not external proof. It is a shift in coherence. The conflict here is painful in a different way than it is for INTJ. Because FE wants to preserve connection. FE wants to respond, adjust, repair, soften, clarify. If the field changes, INFJ often moves toward the change rather than away from it. That is where the fracture becomes visible. NI senses that something deeper may already be misaligned. FE still tries to keep the bridge standing. So the INFJ may become gentler in tone, more attentive, more careful, more present. From the outside, this can look like grace, but inside, it is often a test. If I adjust the connection slightly, does the warmth return? If I open the space, does the truth reveal itself? If I respond with sincerity, does the other person meet me there? Then, TI enters, and TI does not enjoy entering this late. Because TI now has to explain something that started as atmosphere. It begins examining details. The wording, the contradiction, the sequence, the context. It tries to give form to what FE already felt and NI already suspected. Sometimes TI helps. Sometimes it only sharpens the discomfort by proving that the mismatch is real. Sometimes it cannot quite prove anything, which leaves the INFJ in one of their hardest states, emotionally affected, intuitively alerted, logically undersupplied. Then SE reacts under pressure. The room becomes too immediate. A glance hits too hard. A tone feels too sharp. The body stays in the interaction, but the nervous system starts tightening around subtleties other people are not even registering. That is why INFJ does not always disappear in these moments. Sometimes INFJ tries to repair the field first. Sometimes they ask a soft but exact question. Sometimes they remain warm while quietly reducing access. Sometimes the door stays open, but only halfway. INFJ experiences emotional shift, then NI interpretation, then TI verification strain, then SE overload. Not mystery, not magic. A relational cognition under tension. For some, it's not about the connection either. For the INFP, the earliest signal is often neither pattern nor atmosphere. It is value tension. Something in the moment presses against an inner line. The sentence might be socially acceptable. The interaction might even remain pleasant. But FI registers a dissonance that does not need public validation to be felt. This is important. INFP is not necessarily detecting hidden truth before evidence. More often, INFP is detecting that something in the exchange does not sit ethically, emotionally, or personally right inside them. That is different from global misalignment. It may be subtle. A joke that asks for self-betrayal in order to belong. A casual remark that reduces something human into something useful. An apology that sounds technically correct but spiritually absent. A tone that asks the INFP to ignore what they know they felt. FI notices first, and once FI notices, the moment is no longer simple. Then NE opens the field. This is where the INFP can become flooded with interpretive branches. Maybe they didn't mean it that way. Maybe they did. Maybe this connects to another moment. Maybe the current discomfort is small. Maybe it points to a deeper pattern. Maybe the problem is the other person. Maybe the problem is what the moment is asking the INFP to betray in themselves. NE does not settle the feeling. It multiplies possibilities around it. Then SI enters with quiet force. SI checks the moment against memory, not as cold data, but as lived imprint. It recalls other times the atmosphere looked fine while something essential felt quietly compromised. It remembers the texture of previous disappointments. It notices resemblance. Now the discomfort becomes denser. Then TE arrives, often awkwardly. TE wants to know, can I justify this? Can I say it clearly? Can I point to something concrete? But TE is the inferior function here. It may come out blunt, delayed, overly sharp, or not at all. That is why INFP does not have one standard reaction. Sometimes INFP grows quiet because they do not want to speak before the feeling is clear. Sometimes they ask one unexpectedly direct question. Sometimes they become more sincere, not less, because the false tone in the room becomes intolerable. Sometimes they pull back later, after trying to stay open in the moment. INFP experiences value tension, then NE branching, then SI resonance, then TE pressure. Not, I know the hidden reality. More like, something in this asks me to abandon an inner truth, and I can already feel the cost. That is a very different fracture. And for others, it becomes something much smaller, but harder to ignore. For the INTP, the disturbance often begins with a smaller point. Not a whole atmosphere, not a symbolic trajectory, a discrepancy. A statement that does not match a previous statement. A conclusion that arrives without enough support. A reaction that claims one thing but operates by another logic. A social exchange that seems smooth until one premise fails. TI catches this first. Very quietly. It does not need drama. It only needs inconsistency. Then NE starts generating possibilities around the inconsistency. Maybe there is missing context. Maybe the contradiction is only apparent. Maybe the speaker is imprecise. Maybe the logic is intact but compressed. Maybe the conversation is relying on a social convention that everyone else is accepting without inspection. At this stage, the INTP is not certain. Usually the opposite. They are intellectually activated by a problem that has not resolved yet. That matters because INTP often does not experience the moment as immediate inner certainty. More often, they experience it as growing analytical tension. There is not enough coherence here for me to relax into this. Then SI begins referencing prior structures. Have I heard this pattern before? Does this kind of contradiction usually mean confusion, manipulation, social smoothing, or simple carelessness? What category does this belong to? SI gives context, but not always closure. Then FE enters as pressure. Because even if the discrepancy is logical, the moment is still social. And now the INTP has to decide whether to say the inconsistency out loud, let it pass, or keep tracking it while remaining outwardly normal. That is rarely comfortable. FE inferior often makes the social cost feel heavier than expected. If they speak, the room may shift. If they don't, the internal model stays irritated. So INTP reactions vary. Sometimes they ask a clarifying question that sounds almost neutral but lands like an X-ray. Sometimes they go silent because the conversation is no longer worth processing at full depth. Sometimes they keep engaging while mentally reclassifying the person as unreliable, imprecise, or too socially edited to reason with cleanly. Sometimes they return later with a more articulated challenge after the structure has had time to settle. INTP experiences logical inconsistency, then NE expansion, then SI categorization, then FE discomfort. Not prophecy. Cognitive dissonance with nowhere graceful to go. And this is where the difference becomes impossible to ignore. Now the contrast becomes clear. INTJ doesn't experience this as something feels wrong. It registers more like a shift in structure, as if the pattern itself has quietly bent away from where it was going. INFJ doesn't think this makes no sense. It feels the change in the connection first, like the emotional truth of the moment has already moved somewhere else. INFP doesn't frame it as, I see the hidden structure. It feels more personal than that, like something just crossed an inner line that can't be casually ignored. INTP doesn't land on, I already know what's happening. It gets caught in the inconsistency, a flaw in the coherence that keeps pulling attention back, again and again. Same quiet room. Nothing obvious has changed. But internally, the cause is different every time. And that difference is the entire point. And still, from the outside, these moments are easy to misunderstand. Because the external event can remain almost nothing. No argument, no confession, no evidence anyone else would call definitive. Just a micro-event. A sentence, a pause, a turn in tone, a logical skip, a value violation too small to prosecute but too clear to ignore internally. And this is where many INXX types become misread. You looked fine, you stayed polite, you kept speaking, but internally, the moment had already divided, not into truth and falsehood, into trust and observation. That is the real shift. And this is the exact moment something internal changes. Not outside, but in how you relate to what's happening. Once observation replaces trust, even temporarily, the interaction changes texture. And once that shift happens, it's very hard to return to the moment as if nothing changed. The INTJ starts testing the structure. The INFJ starts testing the connection. The INFP starts protecting the inner line. The INTP starts testing coherence. Not all of them withdraw. Not all of them stay. Not all of them are right. But all four can feel the cost of continuing as if nothing happened. You know this state. The room keeps moving, and part of you no longer moves with it. You are still there, but more carefully. Still speaking, but with less surrender. Still listening. But now your cognition is doing double work, participating on the surface, tracking beneath it. That is exhausting. And it becomes more exhausting when nothing visible arrives to confirm or dismiss the signal. So the mind stays open, but not innocent. That is the unresolved ending of this pattern. Not certainty, not closure, just a change in how the moment is held. Sometimes later, evidence appears, and the early signal makes sense. Sometimes it doesn't, and the mind has to admit it built too much from too little. That possibility must remain, because cognition is not omniscience. It is a way of filtering reality with gifts and distortions braided together. Still, the first fracture matters. Because once the ordinary stops feeling convincing, you do not return to the scene in the same way. INTJ, INFJ, INFP, INTP. Same silence. Different reason. And sometimes that difference begins before the world has language for it. Not before reality exists. Before reality becomes visible enough for everyone else to call it real. That is where these minds start changing their distance. Quietly. Precisely. And not always for the same cause. Sometimes nothing happens after that moment. And still, something already ended.